Hello again, folks. Martin Lehner here from Orange Technology, and in this video I want to talk to you guys about RAID. So RAID. For those of you who don't know what RAID is an acronym, R-A-I-D. It stands for, what does it stand for? Random Array of Independent Disks. Random Array of Independent Disks. RAID, yeah. That's what it is. And basically what it is it allows you to take multiple separate hard drives and basically connect them together to make one logical volume. So like for example, your C drive. So if you have a 1 terabyte and 1 terabyte hard drive, you can make your C drive look like it's just one single 2 terabyte hard drive. Okay. There's a couple levels of RAID, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There are two very popular setups for RAID, and let me get you an appliance here, and I'll show you guys one of them. Lost my earpiece there. Okay, so this is a QNAP NAS, so a network attached storage server, right? So it's a network attached storage appliance. Basically, what happens is these front things pop out, and you pop hard drives into there. These trays pop out. They're hard drive tray, essentially. And they go in, and that's it. Away you go. So these are really popular right now for data storage. And what I'm seeing is they're very popular for backup purposes. A lot of people are deploying these network attached storages for backup purposes, so for image level backups of hard drives and servers and things like that. Very quickly, we'll go through a couple of levels of RAID. So there's the most popular ones are basically RAID 0, RAID 1, and RAID 5. RAID 0, is it 0 or 1? I always confuse these two. RAID 0, if I remember correctly, and I could be mixing these up, so if I am, I am. But RAID 0 is basically where you can take multiple hard drives and you can combine them into one logical volume, right? So that's where you take, three 1 terabyte hard drives, and they become one 3 terabyte hard drive, the way you see it as a mountable volume, whether that's a network share or however you mount it as a volume, that's what it would look like. There's a couple of disadvantages to how this works. For example, the total size of your volume, because the data is spread equally on all the disks, it's limited to the smallest size of any single hard drive. So if you're using RAID to create large hard drives, you want to make sure you have the same size hard drive. So if you want to make a 16 terabyte drive, then you want two 8 terabyte hard drives. Or in cases like this, where you have 4 bays, you can get four 4 terabyte drives. RAID 1 is mirroring. So this is where you have a pair. So again, if we look here, most people who are using RAID 1 and mirroring, they have a 2 bay NAS, not necessarily a 4, but essentially what it is you have identical hard drives in both sides, and then they mirror each other in real time. So what you're protected against basically is failure of the hard drive itself. So a lot of people are using that as a backup, and that's one of my issues why I don't like RAID, and we will talk about that a bit later on. RAID 5 is essentially where you have one logical volume, but you have redundancy in the drive. So the way the data is written, for example, and it's not exactly like this, but you can think of it like this. If you have 4 hard drives that are a terabyte each, right, you would basically have a 3 terabyte volume. So one drive that looks like it's 3 terabytes in size, but really you have 4 terabytes of storage. And what happens is that fourth is actually a redundancy. So bits of each of the other 3 are written to that fourth. So if any of these first 3 die, right, there's enough information on the fourth that you can recover all of the information and you don't lose any data. That's the idea. And if I do remember correctly, in RAID 5, I'm a little bit out of touch on RAID. I have to look this stuff up whenever I have to talk about it, because again, I don't like RAID. I don't advocate for it, and I'll explain that. But you can actually have 2 hard drives that can fail. Is that RAID 5? Is it like RAID 8 or something? RAID, or is that a RAID 1 and 0, a 10? I don't know. Anyways, there is another RAID version where you can have more than 1 hard drive fail. So you can have like 5 drives and 3 of them basically house the data and 2 are used for redundancy. Now, here's kind of the problem. I think RAID sucks. I am labeling this video as RAID sucks. And I'll tell you why RAID sucks and why I think it sucks. So I've got a lot of clients that are using RAID as a backup tool, okay? The problem, so there's a few problems with this. Number one, RAID 1, for example, for mirroring, is not a backup tool. What it does is it is a RAID 1, where it mirrors to both drives simultaneously, is a redundancy for hard disk failure. That's it. It is nothing else. It is not a backup. It is not a security. It is not anything like that. It is a redundancy for hard disk physical failure. That's it. Now, why I say that? Why do I say that? So in RAID 1, what happens is when you write data to your network attached storage, to your volume, it writes simultaneously to both sides, okay? If you hit delete on a file, it writes it at the same time to both sides. If you overwrite a file, it happens at the same time on both sides, right? The idea is if a drive fails, you don't lose anything even if you saved something 3 minutes ago, because the information that's on the second hard drive is identical in real time to what's on the first one. The problem with this is a lot of people think, oh, I've got 2 hard drives, I have a backup. Well, no, you don't actually have a backup. If you get infected with malware, if you get infected with a ransomware, CryptoLock or CryptoWall, anything like that, both drives have it at exactly the same time. There's no way to go and recover the data off the second hard drive because it's exactly the same, right? So as soon as you change something, as soon as you delete something, overwrite something, create something, it happens simultaneously on both drives at the same time. And a lot of clients do not understand that it is not a backup, right? It is a redundancy for physical hard disk failure. That's it, okay? So that's my first problem with RAID, and how it's sold and how it's implemented. Most times, quite frankly, the RAID arrays I'm seeing are a terabyte or 2 in size, right? There are advantages to using RAID. I will state that, and you know what? Let's quickly go through them now. If you need mass storage, RAID makes absolute sense. If you need one logical volume that's 30 terabytes in size because you're storing, I don't know, GIS maps. GIS, or for those of you who don't know what GIS is, have a look at it. You can Google it online. It's basically plotting like maps. There's actually job positions called GIS technician. I don't exactly remember what GIS stands for. I know, I just can't think of it at the moment. But it is related to mapping and plotting. So when you talk about looking at land area, land development, all that kind of stuff, that's GIS. You'll find GIS used in governments for property development, land registries, things like that. And those are huge files, like literally one map. I've seen actually where one map is 10 gigabytes in size, one map, right? So you think these people have hundreds of maps, they need a lot of storage, right? And quite frankly, they need fast storage, right? Because these files are so huge. So, something like a network attached storage, gigabit Ethernet on the back, right? That's kind of the minimum in the GIS world. And that makes sense, right? So you can stuff in 8 terabyte hard drives. You get a larger network attached storage that has, 12 bays or something, and you can stuff that thing full and you have one logical volume, and it works great, right? And then to protect against hard disk failure, you put it in like RAID 5 or something. You can have a disk fail. It's not a big deal. You swap in a new disk, away you go, right? I understand where that makes sense, right? And I'm not advocating that it makes no sense anywhere. Absolutely not. That being said, I see it used so often for backup purposes in small organizations, terabyte hard drives in them. And I have such a problem with that because people are under the impression, the average person thinks it's a backup. Oh, I've got 2 hard drives, right? Something happens to one, it's not a big deal. But they don't understand that those are real-time mirrored. If someone deletes the data, it's gone on both. You can't get it. I've explained this to so many clients, and clients go, what? But I thought I had a backup. And they're like, no, it's not a backup. It's a physical redundancy, okay? That's my first problem with RAID. Second problem with RAID and why I think it really sucks is, okay, you are covered for redundancy of your drives, right? Let's say you have a 2-bay NAS, network attached storage. That's what I see primarily everywhere. So sometimes I see 4. This one happens to be a 4. I pulled this out of a client's actually, but usually it's a 2-bay. And what I see is there's one of these sitting there, right? There's one of these with 2 hard drives sitting there. It's handling all the backups for a Windows server, or even worse, it is the primary file storage for the organization, and that's it. Here's the problem. What happens if this appliance dies? And this is something I don't see a lot of people talk about, right? Hard drives dying is one thing, right? Hard drive dies, other one's all good, no problem, swap it out. You do have to be careful, and we'll talk about this in a little bit as well. If one drive dies, how much life do you have in the other drive? And this is something we have to talk about. But basically, what happens if the appliance dies? And I've had this happen. I've had this happen at a client that had a network attached storage. It wasn't a QNAP, but it was a different network attached storage. They had a special file system on it, and the appliance died. What you have to know about my area is we do have we seem to experience more frequent power issues than other areas. So we do have power outages. Our grid is not as complex as it is down south. I live in a smaller, more rural area. So, the way our power distribution is, if, like a substation goes down, there isn't necessarily that redundancy built into the network that can just, feed power from elsewhere, and it's not really a big deal. It's a very local thing. We do have power outages, right? It does happen. It's not extremely frequent, but it does happen. Other things we have seen is brownouts, or what appears to be a brownout, right? So where voltage drops. If voltage drops, so power, for those of you that don't know, most appliances like network attached storage and computers and things like that are measured in watts, right? So how do you get watts? So you have a 650 watt power supply or whatever, right? How do you get watts? So watts is a mathematical formulation of volts and amps, right? And volts and amps make watts. So what happens is volts multiplied by amps gets you watts, I believe. Again, look it up. That's what I do. So what happens is when voltage drops, okay, so you're supposed to get 120 volts out of your outlet, right? Standard's about 118, 119, what I've seen. But what if that goes down to, let's say, 100 volts? In order for your appliance, your computer, your network attached storage, whatever, in order for it to be able to make the same wattage, it needs to now up its amps, right? So if you're consuming 3 amps at 120 volts, and it goes down to 100 volts, now you need to consume 3.5 amps or whatever. And the problem with that is that particular scenario is very hard on electronics. Electronics aren't made for that type of scenario. And there's not a lot of equipment out there that protects against that, right? APC battery backups, so UPS battery backups, they generally have a cutoff limit. So I remember looking at one once. Honestly, I don't remember what the brand was, but I remember looking at it, and I was looking up the specs, and the specs said 80 volts. Voltage has to drop below 80 volts before it will turn on to battery power. So if your voltage goes down to 100, the battery backup doesn't do anything. People think surge protectors will help. The problem with surge protectors is, again, they aren't made for that either. They are made to trip a built-in breaker if lightning hits the line and it gets 50,000 volts, right? So it's basically a breaker. It's not meant to help in low voltage situations. Those kind of brownout, we usually call them brownouts, right? And that's really hard on electronics. And so the issue with that is that does happen up here as well. So that's hard on electronics, and we do have appliances that fail, right? I mean, it seems to happen. In my experience, it happens more frequently in the north than in the south. Again, I know a lot of providers down south. I know a lot of IT professionals, and from speaking with them, it seems that in my experience, it happens more in the north than it does in the south. So again, for those of you who don't know me or who haven't seen previous videos, I live here in the Yukon. That's in northern Canada. It's basically on the Canadian side of Alaska. For those of you who don't really know where the Yukon is, we're on the Canadian side of Alaska. We border Alaska. I am 2 hours away from the Alaskan border. I was actually there yesterday. Do enjoy going to Alaska. Alaska is a great place. If you ever have the opportunity to go, absolutely go. So anyways, yeah, so I live pretty far north. It's more of a rural area. The city that I live in is just under 30,000 people for a population. It is the capital city, so it's not very large. So that being said, we seem to have a disproportionate amount of hardware that fails, of equipment that fails because of power-related issues. So with that, what happens if this fails? Hard drives are fine. Let's say the drives are fine, but this appliance fails. What do? You can't exactly just take a hard drive out and plug it into a dock or another computer and have it start working. Doesn't work like that. It's RAID, right? It's built for this array. It is built for this particular appliance. Now, I will say RAID on a whole is a standard. But that being said, have you ever tried taking hard drives out of a network attached storage and just plugging them into another one and seeing what happens? Have you ever tried that? I've had to try it, and for whatever reason, the new network attached storage did not like the drives and wanted to format them. They could not rebuild the array with the data intact. Now, I know it's possible to do, but in my experience, that's not exactly how it works. It's not how it happens. So if you have that issue, this is a QNAP, right? Do you have this exact same network attached storage model sitting on your shelf where you can try and recover the data? Because again, I will say the particular client that had a failure, it was a QNAP. It wasn't this one. It wasn't one that I had installed. It was something somebody else had put in previously to my company, managing and administrating the computer network. And somebody else had put in this network attached storage and the appliance failed. So I had a Synology, also it was actually a 2-bay. The QNAP was a 2-bay, the Synology was a 2-bay, and I plugged the drives into the Synology, and the Synology didn't like it, wouldn't rebuild the array. And this is one of those things, right? You can't just stick that hard drive into another computer, look at the data, and copy paste it. It's not that simple. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, hey, RAID's a standard. There are ways to recover it. You just need to use the proper tools. Well, the problem with this is that takes time. A, time is money. That's the first thing, right? Somebody's got to pay for that. And B, the client's down. They don't have their data, right? Or their backup's not working or whatever. They're worst case, they're completely out of commission. Their database is on there. Their point of sale tools are on there. Their whatever is on there, and they can't operate. Or, best case, they don't have a backup that's running, right? I mean, all of that's bad. None of that's good, right? None of that's a good scenario. So when you're trying to recover the data, RAID's a very difficult way to recover the data, right? It's one of the most complex methods of storing data when it comes to data recovery. I would argue one of the only tougher parts is something like BitLock or something like that. That's very difficult to recover if you don't have the decryption keys. Anyway, so that's what I've experienced, right? And I've experienced, I'll be very honest, I've experienced more failures of the appliance itself than I have of hard drives in the appliance. That is why I do not recommend RAID whatsoever. I do have clients that have a need for it. They have data that's too large to be able to store, on internal server storage space and things like that. I have people that do have a genuine need for RAID and network attached storage for one logical volume of things, right? I have one client that has a database that is so large it would not physically fit on a single hard drive, but it's a single file, so it's not like I can break it up, right? So, they have a 2-bay network attached storage, and the two drives appear to be one volume. Now, but what I have done in those scenarios, so I know you're sitting there saying, but Martin, you're complaining about RAID and talking about how poor it is and how much it sucks, but you've deployed this for a client, so what gives? Well, like I said earlier on in the video, there are certain use cases that do make sense for having RAID. There are, right? There are times you need to have it. So what you need to think about as a technology professional, as a consultant, as a IT manager, or whatever position you have, you need to think about how to make this as redundant as possible. And most people stop. I will tell you 99% of the world stops when it comes to redundancy at the drives. They think I've got redundancy in the physical drives. That's what fails the most. And again, I'm going to argue that the drives don't fail as often as the appliance. In my experience, the appliance does fail. So how do you deal with that? Okay, so I told you about this client that has this database that's too large to have on internal storage. So they have a network attached storage. They have 2 drives in it. The drives are in a RAID configuration that makes them look like one logical volume. The database file sits on that. Literally, the only file that is on this network attached storage is this one database file, okay? And it's huge, trust me, it's huge. So it's sitting there, okay? What I have as well in that same location is a second physical network attached storage with the same specification hard drives in that one, right? And I have a backup running between the two. Right? I have a daily backup that runs between the two. Basically, it's a copy of that file that gets pushed over. Okay? Now, how is that beneficial? Well, again, I mean, it is a partial backup in that there are 23 hours and 59 minutes of the day where if something happened to the one file, we could go and grab the other one, right? Or if someone deleted something by accident and didn't notice for a few hours, we could go back, right? It's only one day though. This file is so big, I can only keep one day. But it does exist, so it is actually a backup. But more importantly, we are protected against failure of the appliance itself. That's the important part, is being protected against the failure of the appliance. So we are protected by failure of the drive, because I have 2 appliances, right? So just so you guys understand, I didn't choose to go with a 4-bay appliance and have the redundancy in the drives, right? Because I knew I was going with a second appliance. So I'm covered for redundancy of the drives because I've got 2 drives in one appliance and 2 drives in the other, right? So if one drive dies, I've got the other ones that have the data. And I'm also covered against redundancy of the appliance itself, because if the appliance itself dies, I have the other one that's running, right? Now, I will say you do have to be careful with redundancy in drives, regardless of what your reasoning is for deploying RAID or anything like that. If you, let's use the example of you have a 2-bay network attached storage, a terabyte in each bay, so 2 1-terabyte hard drives that just mirror. Okay, that's what you have. That's what you've decided is the best idea. If those 2 hard drives were purchased at the same time from the same vendor, okay, let's just say, for example, they're Western Digital Red drives, okay? I like Western Digital Red. I'm a fan of them. But let's just say they're Western Digital Red. You buy the drives from the same manufacturer at the same time. You order 2 1-terabyte hard drives. They come in the mail. They get shipped to you. You've got them, right? Problem with that is hard drives failed because of a defect in manufacturing, okay? Everything fails because of a defect in manufacturing. It is impossible to make a hard drive perfect. The tolerances are very, very close and they're very specific. They're down to the thousandth or 10,000th of an inch or something like that. They're very small, but they're not perfect. So what happens is that imperfection will eventually cause the failure. Maybe that failure is 10,000 hours from now. Maybe it's 100,000 hours from now. Literally, maybe it's 15 years. Maybe you got a hard drive that's just running for 15 years. That can happen. But at some point it will fail because of that manufacturing failure. Now the thing is, that failure happened on the assembly line in the factory. If you're buying two hard drives from the same supplier at the same time, chances are those hard drives were physically in the assembly line, in the factory, they would have physically been very close to each other on the assembly line, right? And the thing is, what you have to be careful with that is if that's the case, then it's very, very likely that they will have the same defect, right? Generally, when you have an assembly line, you have a process, right? That process is very strict, it's very laid out, right? So what happens is, if your tolerances are down to 1/1000th of an inch, that's how they are, and that's how they are for every hard drive that goes through that factory. Every so often, manufacturers will change how they're doing things, what their procedures are, right? So literally, from one day to the next, they will say, okay, we're now going to drill down to the 100,000th of an inch for the tolerance for this particular part. But that change happens, and when that change happens, literally the hard drives from the day before have the old spec, and the hard drives from that day forward will have the new spec, right? So again, what happens is if you buy the drives, both on that new day, of drives that came off the assembly line that new day, again, even though the spec is a lot better, they still will have the same defect, right? So what you want to do, if you can, if this is really that important to you, and your data is that important, what you do is you buy hard drives at different times from different suppliers, right? So you go to, Amazon or eBay or whatever, and you buy a drive, now, and then you buy another drive 6 months from now from a different supplier. And then what you want to do is you want to look at the date stamps that are on the hard drives themselves, and you want to make sure that they're not very close together. For example, you want one from January 2016 and one from November 2016 or something like that, right? Spaced out enough that the likelihood that a change has taken place in the manufacturing process is likely, right? Again, but the thing is, changes don't happen weekly, right? They may happen, honestly, in the hard drive world, I'm not sure. I do know a little bit about manufacturing. Some of our clients are in manufacturing, so I know a little bit about assembly line, production line kind of things. And for those clients, they basically look at their procedures every 6 months, right? So they may change how they do things twice a year, right? So really, that's if you're really concerned about redundancy of your disk, that's what you need to look for. Is you need to diversify your hard drives and when they came off the assembly line. Because what can happen, and this has happened, I've seen this happen once in my life. It wasn't a client of mine. I saw it with another client. I was consulting for another company. Anyways, long story, it wasn't my client, but I actually saw this happen in real time, where they had 4 drives, okay? One failed. And they're like, oh, okay, I'll just swap that out. They took the drive out, and when they took the drive out, a second drive failed, and that was it. The data was gone, right? Because they had redundancy for 1 drive failure, not for 2. And literally, when we looked at both drives, I had a chance to look at both drives, they were the exact same drive, manufactured on the exact same date. So what happened was, whatever defect caused the drive to fail, that same defect was in the other drive. And just by luck, literally minutes apart, they both failed, right? And I've seen that happen. I've actually seen that happen. Again, it wasn't the client of mine, but that data was completely gone. Luckily, it wasn't critical data. It was important data, but it wasn't critical data. But they did lose it. And that's actually when I was skeptical about RAID to start with, just because of these reasons. But that basically caused me to say, okay, I am never recommending, RAID the way most people recommend it to any of my clients. Another example I have, my first interaction with RAID failing is I had a client that had a server. It was a Dell server. It had a hardware RAID card in it, and it had RAID on 2 hard drives, right? So they were mirrored, I do believe. I didn't get to spend much time with this server, and this was quite a few years ago, but I believe they were mirrored. And what happened is one day the RAID card died. The RAID card died. The drives were fine, but the RAID card was dead. And no one locally had one of these RAID cards. It was a special card. I don't exactly remember what the spec was, but Dell has different levels of RAID cards, and this was this particular level, and no one had one locally. I literally had to order one out of the US, and it took 3 weeks to get here. So I had a replacement server up and running. Well, it was actually kind of interesting because we were planning to replace the server anyways, because it was a bit of an older server, and we were planning to replace it. And literally, like, I had the new server in my lab, I was configuring it, and the old one died. The in production one died. Bad luck, right? So I brought the new server on site. I had them up and running a few hours later, but they didn't have any of their data. But at least they could do email and web and all that kind of stuff. But they didn't have their data. And I couldn't get the data for 3 weeks because this card was not available locally. I had to get it specially. It was special ordered, and just shipping, that's how long it takes to get things up here, right? So that was my first experience with where I would say RAID sucks. Because again, if this was just a regular hard drive and the motherboard had died, I could just pop that hard drive in a dock and copy the data, right? Simple, easy, takes a few hours, we're done. We don't have to buy a RAID card specifically to get the data off, and then the RAID card is useless because, that server's old and has no purpose anymore, right? So again, those are 2 examples of real world scenarios that I have experienced and I have seen. Yeah, RAID sucks for that reason. Again, there are use cases for it, but you really need to think about total redundancy. So many people, they just think about redundancy of the drives. They don't think about the appliance. Appliances do fail. They do die. They get fried, right? Whatever. People, maybe somebody drops liquid on them. I don't know, something, right? You can't rely just on one appliance for your backup. The same way you don't rely on a single external hard drive for data backup. The same way you don't rely on anything that's single point of failure, right? I mean, it's one of those things where you have to look at it. Is this a single point of failure? If it is, what can I do to mitigate that, right? Sometimes there's things that we accept as single points of failure. Switches, for example. If you have one core network switch in an office of 5 people, you'll accept just having one switch running, right? You're not going to have high availability on switches. Switch dies, somebody comes in and replaces it, away you go, but you don't lose data, right? So this is one of those things you have to think about. If you don't have redundancy, if you've accepted single point of failure, have you accepted that you may lose all your data? Or that it may take a long time to recover the data, or it may cost a lot of money, right? Again, if something happens to the appliance itself and the RAID array won't come back online for some reason, the data is on the drives, but you can't access it. What do? You have to send that out to a data recovery professional, right? A clean lab, basically. And that's thousands and thousands of dollars, right? Rush service costs even more if this is important data and you need it back, right? For business functions, for business continuity. That can get really expensive really fast. And again, given that, and if that occurs, was RAID worth it? Was it worth going with this particular solution, right? So those are the things you should be thinking about. Again, I could talk all day about RAID, but I try to keep the videos to the 30-minute marks. Again, for uploading purposes, they take forever for me to upload, and I only have a certain amount of bandwidth usage, gigabyte usage, every month from my ISP, so it makes it difficult to upload the videos regularly if they're too long. But again, I could talk all day about RAID and why it is or isn't a good idea. Mostly it's not a good idea. But yeah, those are a few things you guys should think about as technology professionals. Really think about your single points of failure. Really think about where your redundancy is. So many people focus on redundancy of the disks, and they don't think at all about redundancy of the appliance itself. So yeah, that's it for this video, and I will see you guys at the next one.